To be an ally is really about recognizing that you're doing something that's greater than you. It's not about you. You're doing something that will provide the opportunity for transformation, for healing, and for a better world, a more integrated world, a world where we can have these conversations with one another when harm has been caused.
Welcome back. Here we are at episode 101. Thank you as always for being here, and welcome if you're new here. Until this series, we had a flow of alternating between a man and a woman each week on the show, and we've scrapped that. Also, I was so aware of its gender binary and the need to be less restrictive in this way. As it happens, this season has come together with mostly female voices of colour, and the episodes have been incredible. If you would like to support us as a member of The Future is Beautiful, you can do this by joining as a patron with a monthly donation of your choice, or as a presence member, where you get access to workshops and a whole lot more. A lot of love and care and time goes into the making of this show, so that kind of support is very welcomed and necessary. And don't forget, if a specific episode over the past 4 years, or maybe a culmination of them, has influenced you and brought tangible shifts into your life, can you share the story with us? I know that some friends and patrons have shared and feel it would be so beautiful to hear a collage of these stories, and it will be powerful for our community as well. If you have a story, then please make a voice note and send it to connect@thefutureisbeautiful.co by Thursday the 1st of October. You can find the details of what to include on our newsletters and on our social media. We are excited to be launching our leadership program this September that is going to be open to anyone who wants to let go of a whole load of limiting beliefs, heal trauma, and bring your life deeper into your own soul radiance and purpose so that we can co-create a beautiful future. There is the Presence Leadership Mentoring, which has the one-to-one support over 3 months, or the Beautiful Leadership Immersion, which is an online journey which I feel is less of an online course and more of an experience that you integrate into your life and into your surroundings with this extra support coming through the computer waves. When we started this project in 2010, I often said we create the future by how we spend our time, money, and energy. And this immersion is really an opportunity to reassess all of this in light of everything that's come to the surface this year in a supportive and transformative environment. There are 10 modules over the 13 weeks, which include rituals for well-being, presence meditation, the beauty way, and then the 7 core modules: redefining leadership and worth, shadows, trauma and liberation, embodiment and biohacking, edge-walking vision and intuition, sacred activism and decolonization, creativity and flow consciousness, collaboration and community. I will be facilitating this program with a guest faculty made up of people that you will know from this show. Enrollment is open now until we begin on the 14th of September, and I would so love to share this journey with you. For this week's conversation, we are on the theme of anti-racism. We've been talking a lot about race and decolonization over this series and over the podcast in general, and it feels like perfect timing to be hosting this particular conversation, which is an education piece on what it means to be a good ally and how we can actually begin to dismantle this system moment by moment, interaction by interaction. My guest today is Nova Reid, an anti-racism activist, TED speaker, and author of debut book The Good Ally, which is out in autumn 2021. Often described as a force to be reckoned with, she uses her professional background in mental well-being to encourage mindset change, working with organizations and individuals to improve systems of discrimination from the inside out. Nova has worked with leading social justice organizations, including Change.org, and is a popular keynote speaker and regular mentor on the South Bank Centre's Women of the World WOW Festival. In March 2019, Nova was invited to lead a panel at the UK's first She Summit, and in the same month she was honoured to be named one of the top 100 Black British women by the Black Magic Network as part of the International Women's Day 2019, and was nominated for a National Diversity Award. Nova regularly appears on leading media, including BBC News, Sky News, and BBC Radio, as an expert on race and diversity matters. And in 2018, Nova was invited to attend the royal wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to provide expert media commentary. Nova is a passionate advocate for equality and helping people to be the change they want to see in the world. And what I really enjoyed about this conversation with Nova is that she has an incredible lightness and sense of humor and joy. And so we were able to talk about these quite prickly, well, very prickly issues that affect all of us in a way that's light and easy to digest and really opens the doors for transformation. In this conversation called Allies of Joy in a Systemically Racist World, we explore the themes of anti-racism, allyship, and curiosity as we contemplate the question, how can we form new patterns of behaviour to heal our racial bias? I hope this episode moves you to a place of understanding, healing, and courage. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I am absolutely delighted, Nova, to welcome you to The Future is Beautiful. We were talking about bringing you onto the show, I think, a year ago, and it feels like it's been a very big year.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for having me. But yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago.
I'm really curious as we sit here towards the end of the summer, and we've had this particularly lively few months around the understanding of anti-racism in the world. I'm so curious to hear like what you make of this moment that we're in now and what has been happening over the summer.
It's a big question. It's full of contradictions for me, which is everything about what anti-racism work is. It's pain and trauma and frustration that it takes so much public displays of violence for so many people to wake up, because none of this, of course, is new. It's been going on for centuries. That was really painful for me. But equally, it's a momentum I and my colleagues who are anti-racism educators, even activists, renowned activists and authors and scholars like Angela Davis are saying she's never seen a movement for racial justice globally like this ever. And so that gives me goosebumps, because we are definitely shifting and change is happening. So it's both of those things. It's been a really, just the contradictions of the sadness and the pain and the frustration, coupled with, well, okay, something like that clearly had to happen in order for this momentum to finally take hold.
I've personally found, and talking to other people of colour during this time, that as beautiful as it's been, that there's this interest and this willingness to understand things deeper and from a different perspective, that it has also ended up being very laborious and traumatic.
Oh gosh, yeah. And that's what I found really curious in sort of the days after, in particular, because it wasn't just George Floyd's death, but I think that was the biggest catalyst, everything that had been running up between the lost lives before that. And, and then George Floyd, and then this momentum. And I've only just started to catch up on my emails since June. I was getting about 300 emails a week. My following nearly quadrupled. Business increased. It was very peculiar. And I found the most curious thing, because now I've got the space to start looking and seeing if I've missed any emails or any correspondence. So many emails came through within days of his passing. And the majority of emails that I received, there was no acknowledgement that I, as a Black woman, might be experiencing some kind of trauma. It was like I was separate from what was going on. And then, of course, there were those emails that, like, if this isn't the right time for you, I completely understand. Please just be honest. So it's really interesting to see the disconnect for some people that whilst I'm an anti-racism educator, I'm a Black woman. And before that, I'm a human being. Really interesting.
Yeah, I had something similar with a project that I was doing, which was centered around people of colour. It had been planned out over the whole year. There were a few parts of it that were starting around that time. And the organisers were like, can we just do it all now? And I was like, can we not?
Gosh. Yeah.
And my reaction being, because I felt physically, emotionally overwhelmed in my own system. Plus, I was already doing that work, and there was no way that I was going to other people of colour and asking more of them in that time frame as well. I know that it came from sort of like a well-meaning intention, but also this sort of like, let's catch the wave whilst people are paying attention. And it's like, well, let's just hope that this is actually opening up something that's going to be long-term healing, not a week or two of a fad.
Yes. And that was the thing. There was a lot of performative allyship that came out of that, blackout squares. I'm like, who is that actually helping? But I call it this insatiable appetite. Give me all of the information now. People had a huge sense of entitlement over me. It's actually quite therapeutic to talk about it. I had people emailing, asking me to provide training, for example, even though I had an out of office, because I was also teaching still. I had something in the diary. I had an anti-racism live course, or I had 70 white women where I'm holding space for them to start excavating their racism. And that was days after George Floyd. So I had to lean in to dig deep to do that. So I was not at my desk, and I had a very clear out of office. Somebody then showed up in my DMs saying, have you got my email? And then they didn't get a response from my DMs because my Instagram had blown up. I'm not seeing my DMs anymore. They contacted a colleague of mine who we have mutual connection with to ask me if they'd received my email. And I thought, wow, that is really interesting that these boundaries, I had to really ramp up my boundaries, and like, I am not available. It was very interesting. It was a learning experience for me because I'm quite personable. And before I could do that, when I had a smaller following and much fewer emails a week, and when it grew, I could no longer be like, I had to really firm up my boundaries. So yeah.
That's really interesting. I had a similar experience, nothing like what you're describing, because this isn't my topic that I share about regularly, but I can really relate to that experience of boundaries coming from a place where if people really wanted to talk about race in the past, I have always been very willing, because actually that doesn't come up that often. Like, it hasn't come up that often. I've always been really willing, but then suddenly this kind of overwhelm and almost like this completely unconscious owning energy of like, you're a brown person, I know, like,
yes, oh my goodness.
and then me just being like, whoa,
yeah,
okay, like, in my own time.
Yes.
Yeah, in my own time. That being a very different way of relating to it, of like, actually, I'm not going to be commodified in this moment.
Yeah. And again, it's not necessarily a conscious thing that they're doing, but it's almost like they're trying to weaponize and prove, see, I'm not like one of those ones, and I've got you as evidence, or can you help with this? And it's forgetting that we're human beings. It's very interesting to watch. That whole period was a psychological experiment on TV. I think it would have been very interesting to watch the behaviour.
Tell me about it. I mean, I found out my dad was dying 2 weeks into that period.
Oh gosh.
And I was just like, and so obviously
So
that's
sorry.
like, oh, it's okay, it's part of this cycle, but obviously that's like a whole other, when anyone close but a parent is dying, you become so much more in tune with their lives and their experience and their parents, and the whole waves of ancestry open up.
Yes.
Being in this time where like everything on TV and on Instagram was around race, and then kind of being taken into this internal and like family like environment where all these memories were coming up of, you know, of a history that's really not that old. Like my father was born in British India. Independence came the following year, but he was born into that, and then he came here, and so many experiences, and the amount of trauma that those images and hearing everyone talk about their experiences and remembering all kinds of experience, like it was so intense to do that over a couple of weeks.
Very intense, isn't it? With bereavement on top. And then also, it was really easy to forget, but not, that also we're in the middle of this pandemic where Black and brown people were also disproportionately dying or being impacted by CV-19, and people weren't able to go to funerals. So with this, I just felt this huge collective grief, collective trauma, and also collective rage.
And where do you feel like all that energy is now?
I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think if you haven't got a vehicle to express it, it's probably still there under the surface. There is definitely a change in energy. I think there is some apathy showing up. We've kind of had enough of this talk about Black Lives Matter now. Can we move on? What about this? What about that? So that's a dynamic that we're seeing now.
Yeah. It's going to be really interesting to see what the lasting shifts and healing are that come from this time. And my hope is that it wasn't just like a moment of exposure that was in vain. And I'm sure it wasn't. I know it's really complex and it will take time because it's something that's so ingrained in us for generations back, that it's not something that can be healed with a hashtag or
yeah, absolutely. And you know, that's part of some of the British culture, is part of me as well. You know, you want a quick fix, like you want everything now. With something that's so systemic, you're undoing centuries worth of behaviour, thinking, programming, systems, education, like an entire infrastructure. And I think once people started to realise the enormity of actually what tackling systemic racism will mean, I think it's probably become a bit overwhelming for some, if I'm honest, because it's not a quick fix.
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about when I've heard you speak before and the framing of anti-racism rather than racism is this acknowledgement that we are all racist. So that kind of finger pointing thing, like, well, that person's a racist, but I'm not a racist. But that's it's like that there's systemic racism in everything, and that we are all subject to it at some time. And I would love you to share more about that and about unconscious bias and how that plays into.
I'm very intentional with the language that I use, because the essence of systemic racism, and it's actually, again, what makes I think it difficult is that it's really, nobody's really nailed down a definition for what institutionalized / systemic racism is. Especially the one that I've read that makes most sense is by Sir William Macpherson, who was instructed to take part in the Stephen Lawrence investigation. He summarizes institutionalized racism in the best way. In order for racism to exist in a system, there needs to be components of prejudice plus power. So I'm intentional with language. So we can certainly all internalize racism. if you are Black and you have been born in a Western society and you have been taught that your way of surviving is to assimilate, that it's highly likely that there's some racism that you are going to have internalized, and there's going to be a little process. It's a very different process for us of healing to get better. But I'm very intentional with the language around sort of systemic racism and prejudice plus power, because we can project prejudice onto one another and race hate onto one another. But what makes systemic racism so insidious is that there's this infrastructure behind it. And not all of us have that because of our social location, because of the colour of our skin. Black and brown people, people of colour, can certainly project race hate and prejudice and discrimination onto one another, onto white people as well. What we don't have is that structural system of power behind us. What was beautifully demonstrated, not beautifully at all, it's the wrong word, but what was so clearly demonstrated in what happened around the time of George Floyd's murder, and I think the week before, Amy Cooper, who was a white American lady in Central Park. She knew, consciously or otherwise, that if she picked up the phone and called the police and lied to the police and told them that a Black man was doing something to her that he wasn't, that the police would believe her over him. That is a clear example of knowing the power of systemic racism. I don't have that. I can't pick up the phone and call the police and say that a white person is doing something to me and have that same power behind. And then it was demonstrated so clearly again, less than a week later with George Floyd's death. A police officer can be so nonchalant, kneeling with his hands in his pocket for 8 minutes, 46 seconds on a Black man's neck. Nobody does anything, nobody says anything, and he knows that the law is, there is something in terms of superiority that knew that he would be, there's nothing wrong with doing that. That's what systemic racism looks like. So whilst we can project race hate onto one another and prejudice onto one another, we don't have the same component of power that people who are white have, because they've been born into a system where white superiority and white supremacy was normalised, was legalised, and where dehumanising of Black and brown bodies was legal. So that's the difference. And it can get really difficult sometimes. And I think because we've had these very public mainstream examples, I hope that that demonstrates the difference between the two. Like, we can all name call at one another, but if you've got melanin in your skin, you don't have a system behind you to back you up.
Yeah, and I would love for you to share a bit more about how that shows up in hospitals, for example, how that shows up in some of the daily elements of our lives, on both sides, like how somebody might unconsciously be acting out some of these systems and how somebody might be receiving them.
Around the time of COVID, so I have an anti-racism course, and quite a number of my students on that course are healthcare workers, actually, which is wonderful. And around the time where we were getting into more of an understanding that Black and brown people were being disproportionately impacted, there was more conversation and curiosity about why. And we kind of moved away from the vitamin D deficiency to really starting to reveal what is going on in hospitals. And there's one midwife who shared a very personal account of what was going on. She is a Black woman. She was also pregnant, and she spoke to her superior and said, I should be shielding. I do not feel safe currently doing my role. I'm in this demographic. There is no further understanding of why we are more impacted, and put a request in to do her role from home and do virtual consultations. And she was met with, well, no, you're not senior enough to work from home. You need to come in or not be paid. And so there were these kind of subtle things that were going on. And then I'm hearing that there was chat in staff room about it being unfair that staff of colour didn't have to be in. And then I was hearing more about, well, why is it that, and this is just one account, but it was curious, why is it that so many doctors who were dying were also from this demographic, but it didn't match. Some of the narrative was that it was because we lived in, cramped housing, intergenerational houses, condensed areas, or that we might have, be living in more poverty. But you've got senior consultants who were also succumbing to this disease, who didn't fit that criteria. I had another midwife say that they often will use agency staff, and the majority of agency staff, for whatever reason, are BME. She noticed that her superior would give an agency staff who was BME 5 COVID patients to look after. An employed member of staff who happened to be white was given 1. If you're having to look after 5 patients who have CV19 and somebody else is only having to look after 1, that's going to affect your exposure to viral load, which increases your risk to getting it. Who's making the decision who gets 5 patients? Another was told that she was not given lunch breaks where all of her colleagues were. So it's getting curious about why are these decisions being made? Why is there an assumption that you can take on more than somebody else? It's opening up a lot. And what we also do is we love our NHS. And as a result of that, we put it on a pedestal. So it means that we find it very difficult to start looking at, right, what's going on beneath the surface. I shared a post on Instagram just this week, a recent study that showed Black babies, and this was a US study, but the stats in the UK are very bad as well. Black newborn babies are 3 times more likely to die if they are in the care of a white doctor. And so that headline is quite emotive. And I said, let's start discussing what might be going on here. And we had a really lovely discussion from healthcare workers, people who have been patients, and sharing their own experiences of the impact of what systemic racism can look like. Because nobody's saying that doctors are intentionally wanting to cause harm, but there's a discrepancy. And one person commented, said she was out in the garden very recently and her neighbours are nurses. They work for the NHS and they're nurses. And she said they were having very racist conversations in their garden with their parents about Black people. She was stunned and didn't know what to do, and found it really contradictory that they could be in this healthcare profession but be holding those views. She also gave some information about their identity, that they were gay men, and said they're also in a marginalised group. So she found it really hard to understand. So, these are just everyday conversations that are happening, but the very nature of what makes systemic racism so powerful and insidious is because we don't address it, because generally it's not people who consciously want to cause harm to people because of the colour of their skin. It's everyday well-meaning people who are good and kind, who haven't unlearned their racism because they don't know that it's there. That's what makes it so dangerous.
And it's interesting at how young unconscious racism, unconscious bias can set in.
Yes. So children start learning racial bias as young as 3 years old. Much of what they are absorbing is from as in adults, nonverbal cues. They already start to learn who is valued in society and who isn't, who is safe and who isn't. That's very powerful. Then that translates into why there were studies at the beginning of this year about racial bullying in the playground increasing, or young Black and brown children wanting to bleach their skin or put powder on themselves. And that was really hard for me to read, because I went through that when I was a little girl, and people are still going through it now. That's systemic racism. Because you already see who society values more just by what you absorb, the dolls you can get access to, the lead characters in stories, who is around you, how your parents or family members might behave, just in terms of body language when they're around a certain group of people or in a certain area. It's powerful.
How can parents unlearn enough of what they're holding, but also proactively teach their children in a different way?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot. And if I'm honest, it was probably one of the driving forces for me to decide to put together an anti-racism course, because before I did this, I was really doing diversity and inclusion. So it's much more general, I guess. less, so a bit more mainstream. But I noticed that people found it far easier to talk about gender inclusion or disability, for example, when I spoke about race, because I would always centre race because it's the one identity that intersects with everything else. Oh, the discomfort was palpable. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I need to lean in more here. And I will always use examples of children in videos because it moves us away from this unhelpful good or bad binary that we've learned. There's, if you're a bad person if you're racist, and you're a good person if you're not racist. Well, actually, it's got nothing to do with it. You can do racist things. You can say racist things and do racist things and not be a bad human being, whatever that means. Whenever I would share videos, it would be of children's racism because it moved us away from that, because children are innocent. They're just learning what they see. And if they're exhibiting racism, then it was just a useful way to help people, move them along. And parents would always come up to me afterwards. They'd be crying or they'd just be really affected by what I was delivering. And they said, I had no idea. You've changed my mind. Where can we learn more? My quick answer to that is we have to first move beyond, if I'm actively choosing to be anti-racist, to be an ally, let me rephrase that. If I'm actually choosing to be an ally and raise socially conscious children, that means you're actively acknowledging that you are not only part of the solution, but it also means that you have been complicit somehow and that there is some unlearning to do, which can make people really, really vulnerable. So I think first there needs to be an awareness, then there needs to be desire, and then there needs to be courage and vulnerability to reveal some dark parts of yourself. The shadow and the light, we have both, and we do this thing where we're just good and nothing else. Like, we all have the capacity to do things that cause harm to other human beings unintentionally and also intentionally. And it's just acknowledging the full range of being human and having the courage to start interrogating. That was a long way to answer that. Sorry.
I don't know. I feel like that was very succinct for a big question.
Yeah. And then the process of learning for some of my students that are on the course, because there is this fear about talking about race, of saying the wrong thing, of not wanting their children, and I talk specifically about people who are white or who hold white privilege, not wanting their children who are white to fixate on race, that talking about race is somehow bad or noticing race is bad. It's not. There's so much research that shows when we don't talk to our children about race, when we don't have these cross-racial conversations, they become unable to recognise discrimination. It has the opposite effect. So actually encouraging age-appropriate conversations is a healthy thing to do. Those conversations become easier when you start going on your own anti-racist journey, intentionally and consciously trying to seek out books, toys, stories, programs on TV where there are different types of characters that are different to your child, so you can start to encourage these conversations. You talk about race with children far easier. Most of the anxiety is ours as adults. Kids are fine.
And I think especially where in the stories the characters of colour aren't like third friend.
Yes.
On the right.
In the distance.
Yeah, but actually like they are the main characters. I just brought my nieces who are mixed race, English and Indian heritage. I just found a book that actually where the parents were mixed race, and I hadn't found one of those yet. And I was like, oh, the daddy's brown and the mummy's white and the kids are like this lovely like mixed like lighter brown. And I was like, and I was upset that I hadn't found a book like that when they were younger, because they'd never seen a representation that looked like their family in a book before.
And I think that's a challenge as well. The publishing industry came under huge scrutiny at first, I think in 2018, and it hasn't hugely improved, but it will now. Probably going to need to fact check this. It was either 1% or 3% of main characters were BME in books, and that was horrific. And then the stats for authors was just as low. So if you haven't got people telling those stories, or white authors thinking about centering those stories, in how they create these characters, then that leaves an absence as well. So, again, systemic racism, it's an industry that's 99.2% white.
I had an experience earlier on this summer where a friend's child said something racist to me. And she just said to me, I didn't have a glorious face because it was brown.
Wow.
And, I know that, like, she didn't understand how loaded a thing that was to say to me. And I had an amazing conversation with her mother, who has taken on like doing anti-racism work and understanding deeper. One of the issues that they have is that they live in an area where there are no people of color. And I know, because when I went to the supermarket, everyone was like, I was like, oh, I've stepped back in time.
I know. Oh, I'd forgotten I was brown. Now I remember.
What do you recommend for people that live in areas that are very white? And obviously as well, like, you can't just go and like, I'm just going to go and make friends with people of color to educate my children, because all us people of color, we're quite busy.
Yeah.
We're not just available to be everyone's like
friends. Like, we're not props people. We're not props. It's the same stuff. It's the same answer. Like, if you haven't consciously and intentionally started to unlearn your own racism, you're going to be given them non-verbal cues, subconscious communication about who ranks where in society. It's just inevitable. Our biases tell us who is safe and who's not. Our biases might mean that we walk down a particular area if we decide to go to somewhere in London, for example, and we walk through a market and we squeeze a hand. That gives an indication to that child that this area is not safe. There's so many things that we do unknowingly, non-verbally and subconsciously, that communicate really powerful messages to children about who is safe and who's not, who is successful, who is beautiful and who's not. The answer remains the same. Going on your own anti-racist journey will massively help, and it will also impact your relationship with other people and also how you parent as a byproduct. And then, of course, there are things that can help. It's being intentional with the TV programs you choose to allow your child to watch, or the stories that you try and get access to, because even though I mentioned there's that low percentage, there's still ways that you can access those stories where lead characters are protagonists. They're out there. Inclusive story time is one that comes off my head. Owlet Press is another one. The Nights Of. So we can start doing things intentionally. I have one of my students who purposefully went to another town. I mean, they had the access to a vehicle which had much more representation in a local playgroup, and she intentionally wanted her child to go there so that they had more opportunity to interact with different types of children. You choose where you live where you live, that's fine, but you just have to be more intentional with it.
Yeah, thank you. And what happens if one parent is willing to do the anti-racism work and the other parent is not?
This comes up a lot. I've seen both scenarios, and also it's really interesting because it's coming up in interracial relationships where they didn't think there was, obviously they were in a relationship together. They didn't think there was this stuff there. So it either goes one way. They see the transformation that their partner's having by doing this work. The partner who's doing this work starts to, as part of this process, initiate conversations about race and racism and how it shows up, and invite them in. That invitation isn't always received. It definitely isn't always received straight away, but it's received. And then they start going on their own journey of learning, and they come together. There are others who it creates huge conflict, where they're like, you're just obsessed with race, leave it alone. You're white. Why are you getting so involved in this? None of our friends want to be around you anymore. And it's causing huge tension within their relationship. One had extreme. One ended up resulting in an end in marriage because she realised her husband was racist, an overt racist. It wasn't like she just realised, she always knew that, but it then became intolerable for her. And then others are like, it's changed my relationship. It's just made it so much deeper. We're more connected. It's incredible. So I think it very much depends on individuals and also what their own stories might be. There's so much shame around this work, and if we're not able to express our shame or be shame resilient, that starts coming out in aggressive behaviour, anger, passive aggression, very ugly types of behaviour, which then become very difficult to live with.
Yeah, definitely encountered through my own experience and through friends' experiences of when you point out like some racism, and not even like in a like, I can't believe you just did this, but just like it happens and you're like, that thing that was kind of offensive, and you do that very British, oh, it was kind of offensive, and that was actually a little bit racist, like massively racist. And it might not even be that it was towards you, but clearly it was demonstrating some bias in there. And that experience of when you do that and then somebody's like, I can't believe you've called me racist, and
yes!
I could not be around you if you think that I'm racist, and it can go so crazy so quickly.
Yeah, it's really, friendships is one of the things I get asked about the most, like how do I deal with this in my friendship circles, because I can't swallow their racism anymore, or their jokes, or their their little everyday stuff, but I love them and they're my friend. And I've also experienced difficulties. Some friendships won't survive and haven't survived. But we've become so, I will say it as it is, we've become so unsophisticated about talking about cross-racially that we get more offended with having racism challenged than the actual racism itself. Like, that's a problem. That's a problem. Like, it's the same. I am a cisgendered heterosexual woman. I get my pronouns wrong. I have misgendered people before, and it feels rubbish. I love humans. I don't like hurting people. But all of those people who are on the receiving end of my awkwardness and my clumsiness with language gave me feedback, and that helps me do better. We struggle to be able to receive feedback about racism because it takes us back to a racist is somebody who is in Britain's First, or the EDL, or one of these very violent, horrible individuals that go around causing real violence and harm to people based on the colour of their skin. And so they hear us giving feedback on their racist behaviour as us saying, you're like them over there. So then, of course, they want to reject that and make out like you're being unreasonable, you're the bad person, that's really offensive. And all the meanwhile, they've caused you harm and they're not repairing the damage. Whereas if they were able to receive that feedback, even if it hurts, like, because when I get it wrong with pronouns or other things I get clumsy with, because we're human, I feel shame, but it passes and then I can do better. And I think if more people just were able to receive feedback, figure out why that's triggering so much anxiety or shame or whatever in your body, get curious about that, and then simply apologize. Or if you don't fully understand, ask to, this isn't my experience, tell me more. Imagine how transformative that would be. It's a very simple thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, as a brown woman, if somebody has reacted disproportionately to my just sharing that something might have been a bit racist, I'm open. Like, if they want to come back into my life and just say, I'm really sorry, like, and we don't even have to make it a huge thing and talk about it. I'm not going to put up like a whole load of hoops that person will have to jump through to get back into my life. But if somebody wants to come and say, look, that just made me feel a lot of shame, and I just had to retreat away from you because of my own shame, but I care about you and I'm here, then like, you're welcome back.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And I'll speak from my experience and let me know if this resonates. I'm not saying it's healthier, but it's far easier for me to swallow friends' racism and not say anything than it is for me to pull people up and call in. It takes more energy, it takes more effort, and I'm putting myself at risk of further abuse or gaslighting or this blow up. So it's far easier for me to just let it pass by. If I am then calling in, pulling up, giving feedback, that means I care enough about the relationship or the situation for us to have some kind of mutual transformation or some kind of learning opportunities to happen there. So if it's met with gratitude instead of defensiveness, again, that would be a more healthy reframe, because there is a risk to us giving our white friends feedback on their racism that we'll receive further racism.
Yes. 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 I mean, yes. I learned very, very early on, anytime I've ever just tested it out to see if the waters have changed, it hasn't. I can't call racism out or call racism in just as a casual thing because it's not meant to be there. It always has consequences, and the consequences are always labor for me. It is much easier to just, someone says something racist and just to go and have a shower and get on with my day than it is to engage in a dialogue around it. And if I'm engaging in a dialogue around it, it means I care. It means that I believe enough in those relationships to know that we can do better and to know that we can be part of the healing that's so needed in the world. But I have, as I'm sure you have, and many of us have, so many stories of when that has gone very wrong.
Bad. I mean, yeah, and I use the stories now just because I often get asked by people of colour, like, how do you deal with this on a daily basis? Like, help me, I'm having a really difficult time with a friend. How do I deal with this? And I will use my own experiences. Yeah, some of my friendships have not survived. Certainly how I teach anti-racism is about collective healing. For me, it's all about mutual transformation, because if you can get your friends who you love because they're your friends along this journey with you, because the barrier that's not spoken about is that friends who have us as friends, it cognitively doesn't make sense to them why we would be saying that their behaviour or something that they did was racist, or something that they said was racist, because how can I be racist? I'm your friend. And so that provides this barrier where they disengage with this work, because they think, well, because we're friends, clearly I don't need to do this work. And it's now saying, like, I've got language. I understand more about microaggressions now. I have the language. And also, I'm nearly 40 years old and I am not swallowing it. I am not swallowing your racism anymore. I care about my healing, and part of my healing journey is to be able to tell you when your racism is hurting me or when your behaviour is hurting me. Racism aside, just holding these boundaries about what you will and will no longer tolerate. And for some friendships, if you haven't done that before, they can find that really difficult. But it's about your healing and your well-being, and your sense of peace comes first. I will always say that, especially to people of colour, because we live in a racist society. Our trauma is triggered so often.
Somebody could be married to a person of colour and have children with a person of colour and still have a lot of racism in their system that is unresolved. And then that can be like, but I'm not racist because look, I've got half brown children, like, my children are brown, like that, I'm not racist. But then it's like, well, yeah, okay.
my response to that, I get a bit cheeky sometimes, but my response to that is, let's go back through history, shall we? Let's explore all of whether it was through sexual abuse or a relationship with enslaved Black women and the mixed race Black children that were born out of a very volatile institution of slavery. That doesn't make a difference. You can have sex and being in a relationship with somebody who is a different ethnicity and still be racist, overtly and subconsciously. Doesn't make a difference. In the same way, it's like saying, well, I can't be sexist because I've got a mum.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Yes, you can.
The patriarchy doesn't affect me. I was born from a womb. It's like,
It's like, yeah, there's no logic there. I mean, they use it as a defense, but it's like, let's break that down a bit, shall we? So my method is a lot around curiosity. So how have you come to that thinking?
Hello. We're taking a short pause from the conversation. On behalf of our team and our community, thank you for being here and co-creating The Future is Beautiful. Much dedication, love, and time goes into the production of this show. We believe in being advertising free in a world that's always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. And so we make this show with you and for you, thanks to your support. There are 3 ways you can be more involved, so we can share the vision, wisdom, and creativity here as we explore what it means to be a human in this time. You can support the podcast by sharing it with your friends, posting episodes on social media, and doing iTunes reviews. You can support as a patron by making a monthly or one-off donation of your choice. And with this, you join the global patrons group and monthly video calls where we share connection and insight. You get to know the other amazing patrons from around the world, their stories and their work, and you offer direct support to me and the team, as well as being brought into the behind the scenes of creating something like this. It sounds like a lot, but it's as much or as little as you want to get involved in. You can become a member of Presence, our membership collective of care and practice, where we explore how to embody the themes of the podcast with workshops, calls, special events, tree whispers, and powerful tools, practices, and rituals that you can bring into your life. This is open to absolutely everybody as we create an inclusive and diverse space that celebrates well-being as a human right, where we explore together what it means to be creative, courageous, and connected to ourselves, each other, and the earth. This is about embodying sacred activism. We love meeting patrons and Presence members and how being part in this way weaves our lives together, as well as making this show possible. If anything from this conversation has moved or inspired you, please get more involved. All information can be found at www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community. This show really can't go on without your patronage and Presence membership, so please do make it happen. And now, back to the conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about children, friends, partners. What about older generations?
Again, it's a mixed bag. I remember being contacted, and I can't remember if it was this year, because this year just feels super long. If it wasn't this year, it was towards the end of last year, by somebody in their 70s. And they had found my work online, or they'd been recommended me, I can't remember. And they sent me a personal message, and it was beautiful. And they said, I always thought I was not racist. And I always thought that there was nothing more for me to learn. Oh, how wrong I was. And she's doing this work now, and she's in her 70s. And she said it's just changing her life. And I think that's beautiful, because it can be vulnerable, especially when you, not even just, an older generation, but equally when you're a parent, there's this perhaps pressure that we put on ourselves that we should know everything. I'm like, of course we're not going to know everything. Like, we're never, ever going to know everything. Like, I am always learning. There are things I talked about when I first started teaching that I don't talk about now, or I have changed my stance on. Like, we're always evolving and learning. We're designed that way. I thought that was wonderful, because there's often a perception that, that's just the way they are, just leave them to it. Oh, they don't mean any harm. But actually, there's nothing stopping us having curious conversations with people who are older than us to better understand where they're coming from and to keep going with that.
And so not just having to accept that grandparents, friends' parents will be racist. I mean, because I had that a lot when I was a kid. Oh, like, my grandma's coming over. Actually, it's not a good idea if you're here when my grandma comes over, because she's really racist.
Yeah.
And they're just being really normal. And okay, better scarf her then.
Again, it depends on where you are in that moment and whether you have the capacity to even want to be around that energy. But yeah, we should be challenging. And maybe I use a different word rather than challenge, getting curious, because of course, they're coming from completely different generations that we have no insight in. So if you go in with curiosity about why they feel that way, see where it leads. And then sometimes you might have the opportunity to say, I find that really painful when you say that, and it hurts me. And I know you love me and you care about me. And seeing how it goes. People try and have one conversation and think that everything needs to be done in that one conversation. And for me, you're sowing seeds over a period of time.
That's a lovely reminder.
Curiosity, particularly with the older generation, is a more useful tool than saying, we don't use that language anymore. It's bad, it's wrong, it's racist. slightly different approach.
Right, because it's about unpacking what actually happened then. Why were those beliefs formed the way that they were? Because also, if you're unpacking that with your older generations, and you're understanding more about where that has come from in yourself as well. And again, you're not shaming, like, we don't say that anymore, now you say this, and then it can get very like, oh, I can't say
shouty. And then there's also, you know, depending on who you're talking to, there's misogyny in there. Who is this young person talking to me in this disrespectful way? There's that going on. Respect your elders. Don't tell me what to do. So there's all of these other things like that's going on with age and, you know, potentially gender as well, depending on who you're talking to. I don't think it's been evidenced. It's a more useful tool for when you have a deeper relationship with somebody, and you don't have to do it all in one go. Yeah.
It's not a quick one, this one.
It's not a quick one. With the climate that we're in, often the retort is, oh, you know, why are we, this happened such a long time ago? And it really didn't. Like, language changes so fast, and what was acceptable within our grandparents' generation in terms of language has changed tenfold. But when they were using, you know, certain language around race, that was the politically correct language to be using. And so now they're hearing, well, when in my day using the word black was bad, and now you're telling me I need to use black, in their body they're feeling huge resistance around this because it's going against what they know. So yeah, it's complex, but not just human. I am very much from a non-shaming approach. It doesn't work. We all know what it feels like to be shamed. Like, if you intentionally shame somebody, we know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that. Majority of us would have experienced that before. If someone feels shame as a result of me calling them in, that's very different to me intentionally wanting to shame them. And I like to give the definition, which is why it's really important. Like, I name my shame, like, oh, you know, I've learned to, I'm feeling really vulnerable right now. Well, that's making me feel shame. And I do that with people who I feel safe around, so that I don't get shamed on top of me talking about the fact I'm feeling shame, and that, you know, it's not making me behave in a way that I'm proud of right now, or whatever it might be. It's human.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we step into kind of new patterns of behavior, there can often be shame there.
Yes.
Can even be doing things that are more healthy, like, as we were talking about boundaries earlier, I find setting boundaries really shameful. I know it's really good to set the boundaries. I know it's good for me, it's good for the other person, it's like healthy, it's needed. Generally, I'm like accommodating, generous.
Yes.
That when I'm like saying, no, that's not possible, that's not okay. And then often, you know, when you set a boundary, people try and jump higher over it. Yes. And you're like, oh, this is getting, and you have to get firmer with the boundary. Yes. And then I can feel a lot of shame around that, because it's uncomfortable, because that has been very much like part of my everyday being. And so when we kind of step into like behavior that's uncomfortable, like, it can often bring up a lot of counter
stickiness. For me, in boundaries, and I'm still learning them, like, oh God, I'll get hot, my stomach will be in knots, I feel like a bad person. I am naturally a people pleaser. So I feel like instinctively when I put boundaries up, I'm being a bad person. When I trace that back through behavior, like, I'm curious, the work I do, you know, it invites me to do that. And I like to trace back, like, where is this behavior coming from in my ancestry? If we've been taught to be subservient, to do as we're told, to assimilate, to not rock the boat, of course we're going to want to bend and mold and do everything that people ask of us. The result of that is burnout, or some kind of, you know, impact on our sense of self or well-being. Again, it's like having compassion, like understanding where that behavior, that pattern of behavior is coming from, and breaking the cycle. And for me, boundaries is part of my healing as well. Like, it doesn't mean, you know, I don't care about you or I don't love you. It just means no. And we have a right to say no. It's something that's vital for our well-being and our sense of self. And also it teaches people how to treat us as well. Like, if I'm all open, then people will take advantage of that energetically.
You are writing a book at the moment, which is very exciting and an intense time in anyone's life. The book is called How to Be a Good Ally.
It's called The Good Ally.
The Good Ally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I totally turned that into a how-to.
To be fair, it is a how-to. It's called The Good Ally. Yeah.
It feels really important, this notion of allyship and understanding like what that really means. I have so many friends that are, have really felt very torn apart as people holding white privilege during these months, realizing their complicity in these systems and really wanting to be good. And then also really recognizing what's in their ancestry, and also recognizing that they don't know how to move forward, without being nervous of making more of a mess or saying the wrong thing, all of these kind of things that we've been talking about a little bit, and how that can silence a lot of people that we need, and it can make people feel really awkward. I would love for you to share some of your invitation into allyship.
Yeah, well, I acknowledge the fear. It's huge and it's understandable. Fear is also the biggest barrier to progress and why we're where we are now, because it stops people from taking action. One of the things I say is you're going to feel the fear, feel it anyway and do it, because it pales in comparison to being on the receiving end of racism every day. It really does. I just want to just share, and I hope it might provide a bit of ease for anyone who's listening and is feeling like this. The terminology white privilege was a term coined by Theodore Allen in the 60s, and the original term was white skin privilege, and it was based on a 40-year study, so a really in-depth study around behaviour. And it noticed that if you put, and it was done in America, in the US, if you put African American people or anyone who is not white in the same social economic background, that people, over and over again, the results were showing people who have white skin do not receive the same disproportionate treatment. And that went on for 40 years. So it simply means that you hold a skin privilege, regardless of your own social and economic background, you experience systemic disadvantage in the same way an African American person does in all of these different economic circumstances. So I like to try and equate it in a way that makes sense for me, because I don't hold white privilege just because of the skin I was born into. For a colleague who may be a wheelchair user, I automatically will hold systematic advantage based on the fact that I'm an able-bodied person. That doesn't mean that it's not helpful for me to hold on to my guilt around that for a prolonged period of time, because it means that I'm centering my guilt around the fact that I've been born with two legs and they haven't, and I'm not actually helping or seeking to better understand how I can use my privilege to help advocate or campaign or do whatever I need to be an ally for them. And again, it gets in the way of progress, and it's nothing for people who are white. It's nothing to feel guilty about. And you're not being blamed for what your ancestors did or didn't do. What we're asking you to do is acknowledge the societal advantages that you have as a result of this racist system and society that we live in, and the benefits that you are still maybe afforded to you because of that. It's having an understanding of that, acknowledging it, and doing what you can to influence change. That's what's being asked, not to feel shame or guilt of who you cannot help but be. That's not what anybody who really cares about anti-racism wants. We want you to acknowledge that as a result of this 40-year study, it means if you have white skin, you have social advantages because of the colour of your skin, and that's it. For me, there's a lot of work around alleviating the guilt, helping people speak on shame, understand where the shame is coming from, and build shame resilience. Because if we don't have that foundation, like, it gets in the way of progress, and we end up being in 2020 still dealing with racism and systemic racism because outcomes don't change because we're all too frightened. To be an ally is really about recognizing that you're doing something that's greater than you. It's not about you. You're doing something that will provide the opportunity for transformation, for healing, and for a better world, a more integrated world, a world where we can have these conversations with one another when harm is being caused. Because it's not to say that we're all suddenly going to do this work and not be racist anymore. That's not going to happen. It will still pop up. But it's like, by doing this work, you'll be able to receive feedback when you've slipped up or when you've caused harm, receive that feedback and seek to repair the damage. So you're not triggering more trauma upon trauma. You'll be able to recognize when something's going on in the workplace, and you'll be able to start holding people accountable for it. You'll be able to start lobbying for things in government. You'll be able to start having conversations with people in your place of worship who are upholding white supremacy. I mean, don't get me started on white supremacy and Christianity. That's a whole other entity which I don't have time for today. But again, when you start to understand where you've come from and how big this is, like there were people who were public lynchings on one day and then going to church on another one. Having more knowledge and information of where we've come from and all of the parts that make us who we are today gives us more information to not repeat cycles and patterns of behaviour that cause harm. And to me, this is about reducing harm and just being better human beings. That's the invitation.
That's beautiful. I can't help but now I've got like an image of like white blonde Jesus in my head.
Oh God, don't get me started.
I just have to share that.
Yeah. Oh, there is so much.
But that's probably not what Jesus looked like.
No, Jesus did not look like that.
I love what you just shared. It feels like that is where the beautiful future and the collective healing can really come together. When we can come to a place where we can just like take out some of the really heavy charge that's kind of in the field of all of this that's kind of unspoken about, unconsciousness, where all the shame is. And when that charge is just lessened a little bit, like, it's not possible to make this a non-emotional issue because we are humans and we're emotional. Yes. And there is trauma. Trauma is emotion. Trauma shows up in emotion, and it's not possible for that not to exist. But to acknowledge that this is a long road that we still are walking, but that we can walk it together and we can enjoy ourselves as we go.
I talk about joy a lot, which for some people might sound contradictory, but it's a vital ingredient, whether you're an activist or you're being an ally, because it's easy to become apathetic or to get frustrated or disheartened. And it's a huge part of building resilience. I also like to add lightness with my work. It helps give a bit of balance because, we're leaning in, we're dealing with some difficult stuff. And so lightness really helps. It helps me to be able to deliver it as a Black woman. But also it's a parallel, like, joy and pain can and do coexist, and they must. So yeah, it's important in allyship and doing advocacy work safely and sustainably.
I love Adrienne Marie Brown's work on pleasure activism.
Oh, that's something for me to look at.
Yeah, that's a book that you'll enjoy.
Thank you.
Yeah, it doesn't matter the circumstances, like whether that joy is our birthright. We must always find time to connect to joy and to experience joy, and no matter what else we are dealing with. And that resilience of joy and community is there in these histories where some of the darkest things have happened, and yet there has been joy and community.
Which is profound. And I read something recently. It was from somebody who was Black and their grandparent was enslaved. And they were saying, like, the extraordinary amount of resilience demonstrated by such a horrendous and violent time is demonstrated in the fact that we're still here. We haven't been wiped out, which could have been possible, which I hadn't thought about it in that way until I read that.
I saw something about the jumping the broom in
Yes.
the celebration of union that enslaved people would do because they weren't legally allowed to get married. And I'm so inspired by that desire for life and to continue and to have children, to bring new life in, even in a circumstance that, for those of us that like are here with our houses and our freedom, and like it's hard to imagine being in that scenario and wanting to live. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that, as people are quite dramatic about what's happening now in 2020, and we're very comfortable in this in this time.
Chaos.
There's chaos, but like we're just being asked to stay at home. We're not being like forced to go and work on someone else's fields. And yet, how can we remember in this scenario that joy and that resilience? And we're in this extraordinary time where education and understanding of systemic racism, of patriarchy, of the way that capitalism and neoliberalism's harmed us, as all of these things are coming up to the surface, like we are here and we're resilient and we are designed to be here at this time to be able to find our way and pave the way for the future.
Do you know what I found really interesting, particularly around the beginning of COVID, when we were seeing all those empty supermarket shelves? It was always people who have more who were able to panic buy, to stock buy, to be able to afford to buy all this extra goods. And then there was something in the press the week after where there was all this food that was spoiled because people had bought so much they hadn't had a chance to eat it. Meanwhile, food banks were depleted. And I'm like, we really have lost our way, haven't we, many of us? And it's always the people who are most compounded by systemic discrimination or oppression that have the most resilience to cope. Isn't that really interesting? The people who receive or have come from the most horrific circumstances and then have to deal with a pandemic on top always somehow find the resilience. And I think that mirrors what you're saying about that period of time. It's just something to get curious about, like our social location and how we respond and our resources.
And whether that's to do with the information that is carried ancestrally, not just the trauma, but the resilience. And whether that is, we kind of have this notion of like, a person can only take so much. And yet it seems that a person that has had to endure a lot has learned how to endure. Yeah. Nova, I want to thank you for the way that you've stepped into this work. I know a little bit about your background, and you were like diversity and bridal like shows and this beautiful stuff, and then now like have really stepped up in this education piece. I wonder if you can share a little bit about your own like resilience and self-care and community care that has been part of this rising up.
Wow.
That you
what a lovely question. Really interesting. A memory has just come to mind from my husband and I's wedding day, when my dad, who's much like me, will just speak off the cusp, and he hadn't written a speech. He just flowed through it. He shared that I always, from a little girl, I always loved helping people. And I don't remember that because he said I was so tiny. That's carried through in everything that I've done. I've always been deeply empathetic, sometimes to the detriment of my own well-being. But I spent years working in mental health, and then around that time I got engaged to be married, and then that's what led me into bridal, because I felt invisible as a Black woman. There was so little representation in the mainstream industry that I started to just write about it, and then that came sort of diversity campaigning for better inclusion. across the board. That led to people asking me to consult. That led to me being invited to provide expert commentary for the wedding of Harry and Meghan and what it might mean to have a woman of colour in the British monarchy, an institution that's intrinsically linked with colonisation.
Didn't go so well, huh?
I mean, they put such ridiculous expectations on her. Like, how do you think Meghan's going to change race relations in Britain? And I'm like, how is Meghan going to change race relations, and why is that her responsibility? Like, individual people need to help change race relations and reform and structural change and the monarchy itself. So do you know what? Their whole union was a great metaphor for how toxic systemic racism is. So you place an individual into an environment that is hostile. Superficially, it looks like we're making great progress. We've got a woman of colour who is half black in the British monarchy, openly being accepted, but not, because it's an institution that's not designed for somebody like her. And that's what systemic racism looks like. It's like you can have all the representation you like, but if what's going on underneath the surface is not excavated, fixed, unlearned, then it's just more trauma after more trauma. Anyway, I'm digressing slightly. So when I started doing diversity training, I always shared about race, and it was always the bit that was most emotive. And then I, wanted to lean into that more. And then I was invited to provide expert commentary for the royal wedding, and I became more and more confident talking about race with non-Black people. So it was always there. I've always been an advocate for the underdog. I remember when I worked in mental wellbeing, it was always the students of colour who would come to see me, because everybody else was white, and they felt unable to talk about their experiences of pain or trauma because the majority of people didn't understand it, didn't know what microaggressions were. I find myself, I guess, in that process getting a little bit lost, because before the wedding stuff, before the diversity, I used to be an actress. So I was always a creative, I was always a storyteller, and I lost my way. I lost my confidence, I had injury, and I also experienced a lot of racism in that industry that made me a shell of myself, and I really lost who I was. Not only having a vehicle for creativity, but being able to talk about who I am, like every facet of my identity, because I so often assimilated that I'd almost become somebody else. And so that's been my journey. The more I worked in mental wellbeing, you have to go through your own therapy, you have to go through a huge amount of training, and there's no way that you can do that without bringing up your stuff. Not only healing, but understanding who I actually am. Those are all of the ingredients that have enabled me to be here now and hold space.
Thank you for sharing some of that journey in a succinct way. You mentioned microaggressions, and we haven't really talked about microaggressions in this conversation, but I feel like it's important just to share the microaggressions build up, and they can affect somebody in terms of the trauma that's created in the body-mind. Sometimes in a way that's way more harmful than like one violent, overt act.
And that's what I talk about a lot. And if anybody who is listening wants to understand what it means more beyond this bite size of a conversation, I did a TED talk. You just Google TED talk Nova Reid, it will come up, on microaggressions. And I like to talk about microaggressions and systemic racism in my work, because they go hand in hand, and they're often, again, caused by well-meaning people who wouldn't even realise that what they're saying is actually causing harm. And I could go out and receive 6 or 7 microaggressions a day, and they build up and build up and build up, and they can show up in the body as trauma. So yeah, they are a real problem with everyday racism, because they go unaddressed.
And with that, something you say in your TED talk is that if something like overtly racist happens, like really someone like in your face screaming at you in the street or something like that, then you're likely to go home and seek some kind of support around that. But when you've just gone out about your day and you've experienced 6 microaggressions, you're probably not even going to tell anyone about that or process that. And not everyone is in therapy and has like those kind of resources, and so that all just gets internalized and it builds up. Because often then if you do say to someone, oh well, this thing happened, well, that doesn't even sound like anything. Like, did you it can sound so silly, but it's like when it's happening, what it is that's happening.
Yeah, you feel and you feel it.
Yeah, it can be a look, it can be something very simple, but it has an effect on the body.
Just to give people an example, if I am shopping and I notice that the cashier is really open, jovial, in conversation with the customers before me who are white. They then come to serve me and I am open, I am polite, I am behaving I'm jovial, I'm behaving in the same way. There's no eye contact. They do the bare minimum. They tell me how much it is. And I give them money, and then they slam my change down on the counter. With the white peers ahead of me, that money was placed in their hand. Those are the kinds of everyday things that really, really, and then you do bring it up. You might bring it up with a friend. It's explained away. It's everything but a form of racism, because they are trying to probably make you feel better, but what that does is gaslight your experience. It invalidates it, and then you get another microaggression because you're not believed. They're problematic because when we speak up about them, we run the risk of receiving further abuse or incident.
They can often be explained away with like 10 other reasons why that might have happened that was nothing to do with why it actually happened. But if you're in a melanated body and you're experiencing this stuff every day, you have often done a self-analysis of like, is it because of this? Do I do this? Is it this? Like, and then you come to, no, I don't think I'm creating this like from my
from your mind,
else. Or from my mind or from my own behavior. For me, that was a big line of inquiry where I was like, am I doing something? Am I mean? Am I giving off vibes? Like, what am I doing that's creating this kind of behavior? And obviously that has a really dangerous impact on a person's worth and confidence. But actually, when you're able to fully acknowledge, no, that's unconscious racial bias happening, that is microaggression, that was real, that happened, then it becomes less personal. And then that also makes it easier to digest the trauma,
to process it, rather than think that you're going crazy and this is all in your mind and that it's you. Can be so damaging because it's explained away and then it's not addressed.
So part of being a good ally is to acknowledge microaggressions,
first to understand what they are, and also understand how you have contributed to microaggressions. Like, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Can I touch your hair? Oh, it feels like a sponge. Oh, wow, you're so eloquent. I don't see you as black. I don't see colour. I'm giving these examples for you to go away and watch my TED Talk, or then, have an appetite to go and read up on them more. The reason I'm using these is that they're really common examples done by well-meaning, kind people, and they can cause us a lot of harm because what they're communicating is you're an other.
Kind of going back to that self-care question, how do you process your microaggressions? What do you do with the 6 that you get every day?
I mean, it's less now because we're all at home. And also, to be fair, since I started working for myself and not having to go into an office, which has been years, it's really reduced. A lot of the microaggressions I used to get would be at work, but I still get them.
I can testify to that.
We still get them when we turn on the news, for example, and the BBC decides to use the N-word in a broadcast. That's a microaggression. So I'm still experiencing them, but my exposure to them in real time has reduced because I work for myself now, and I also choose what clients I work with. That's a choice, that's a privilege. So what do? I now have the language and the tools to be able to call in. If it happens and I feel safe and I feel like I care enough about that exchange, I will call in. Or if I don't, if I choose not to, I will speak on it, either with my husband, either with some of my students or people who are doing anti-racism work, with my girlfriends, I will make sure that I will have that experience validated, because that's really important. I have weekly clinical supervision, which is like therapy, to help me process, probably more so at the moment now because I'm writing a book about racism. It means I am reliving some of my own experiences that I may have forgotten about. I'm also still in a racist society, so still experiencing stuff now. And it's also heightened because of the climate that we're in. That clinical supervision, that therapy is really helping me work through that trauma. Regular self-care. Some days at the moment, I will have a week where I literally do nothing, where it's like I'm so depleted. It's like I need to refill my cup. And I say I do nothing, but there might be 1 or 2 days where I'm barely speaking. And then it's doing things that resource me, like I do lots of mindfulness colouring, I practice singing, I do lots of sort of painting, creativity, giggling, playing around, like things that really, really nourish and resource me. I have a nutritionist, so I look after my nutrition when I'm able. And I also acknowledge that these things need money, which is something I haven't always had access to. And it's been, there are so many things that we can do for ourselves to boost our well-being. And there are so many things where we need support. And sometimes that support isn't accessible to the people who need it the most. So yeah, eating well, having breaks, boundaries, shutting off, and accepting support. So I have some anti-racism students who are really keen to pay it forward with their allyship at the moment, and some of them volunteer their time for me, and they're like, what do you need? Okay, I need this week. And so they offer to help with sort of admin and things. Yeah.
Beautiful. And Nova, when will the book be available? I know it's already available on pre-order.
Yes, it is available on pre-order, Waterstones or Amazon. It's really interesting. They announced it earlier than they would have because of everything that happened. So it's not actually out till September next year.
Right.
But I need to finish writing it. It's changed a little bit because of the climate. So I've been writing this book since 2018, and the world has changed exponentially since then. Then everything happened with the pandemic, and so there's been some tweaks to chapters and things, and there's a bit more areas I want to go into more depth than I would have previously, because there's more understanding of it now in a mainstream space. So yeah, I have to finish writing it first, but manuscripts will probably out in January, and book for public will be out in September next year.
Beautiful. Well, wishing you so much power and resource and love for this process that you're in.
Thank you. It's greatly received.
How would you like people to connect with you? They go to your website. Is it novareid.com, and they can find your anti-racism course and some other amazing resources?
Yes, and also a podcast that you can access via that as well. Or my Instagram is probably where I'm most active, and that's Nova Reid, which is REID official, and you'll find me lurking there at some point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question.
How will you create beauty in the world?